I apologize. The recording just started. She's been doing research not only academically, but she's been doing research in and around the law enforcement space and in and around the intelligence space. I know that she was working after the 1 October shooting in Vegas. She was working on those issues at Mandalay Bay. And now she works for NYPD intelligence as a day job. You know, when you think about counterterrorism intelligence, I can't remember who it was, may have been the mayor of New York at one point, said that it seems that every terrorist has a map of New York in their pocket. And so what a significant and incredibly responsible job Kelli's involved in. You know, we talk about a whole lot of different things here at Homeland Security and emergency management, but Kelli, she speaks my language because she speaks terrorism, and I'm super excited to have her here this evening. So please welcome her with me. And Kelli, thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Dave. Thanks to ISU also for bringing me on. Just bear with me one moment. I'm just going to share my slides.
Those are working.
All right, Dave, can you see that?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, perfect. So I am very, very excited to be on here with all of you this evening, mostly to talk about my research on the role of triggering, or what I refer to as catalytic events, in leading to acts of violence. But I also wanted to share some of my experience, some of the lessons that I've learned along the way, in hopes too that if there's any students in the group thinking about their future career paths, that hopefully you can pick up some nuggets from that. I do have to say, I just have to say it, any views and opinions that I express in the presentation today are solely my own, do not necessarily reflect the views of the NYPD or any of my past employers for that matter.
Well, dang, Kelli, we thought you were speaking for everybody. No? Okay.
Not today. So before I launch into my research, at Dave's request, I wanted to quickly walk through my background, the areas and disciplines that I've worked in. Like I said, mostly to the benefit of any students who may be overwhelmed thinking about which paths to explore post-graduation. But also, I think it too tells kind of a good story of why I ultimately decided to pursue the research that I did and continuing to pursue. So I went into college knowing that I wanted to focus on counterterrorism in some capacity. I studied international politics with a concentration in international security. I would say most of my time in college, most of my coursework was really focused on Middle East security issues, took Arabic. And I think at the time, I thought I had a pretty narrow focus, but I discovered pretty quickly that there were a lot of different avenues that I could take, that I could choose to explore and specialize in post-graduation. So right after college, I like to say I sort of stumbled and fell into a role that ended up being actually really incredibly defining for me and where I am with my career today. So like every recent college grad, I shot approximately 1 million job applications into the ether and was quite lucky to land in the Homeland Security sector of a really small consulting firm where I was able to take on a pretty big role pretty quickly. And it may not have been necessarily the angle that I thought I'd be supporting counterterrorism from, but my role really became supporting exercises, workshops with federal, state, local first responders around the country, mostly to test their capabilities to respond to a variety of threats and hazards, but most of my workshops were particularly counterterrorism focused, mostly on complex coordinated terrorist attacks. And in probably the most impactful experience I've had, I would say, in my career thus far, as Dave mentioned, I supported the after action process to understand best practices, lessons learned from the response to the mass shooting that occurred at the Route 91 Harvest Festival in Las Vegas, Nevada in 2017, which I believe still remains one of, if not the most deadly mass shooting in the US to date. So it was at that point that I realized I had a really strong desire to focus on counterterrorism, targeted violence prevention, mostly from a state and local perspective. So to be part of those with really the boots on the ground, so to speak, when an incident actually initially pops off. So I became an intel analyst with the DC Fusion Center, which is the National Capital Region Threat Intelligence Consortium, bit of a mouthful, and thereafter became similarly an intel analyst with the New York City Police Department. So currently, I lead our global risk intelligence team, which in a nutshell is just our strategic shop tasked with ensuring that our officers, our executive leadership within the Intel and Counterterrorism Bureau, all of our partners, whether in the public sector, in the private sector as well, are up to date and tracking on the latest terrorism related threats. So my team is incredibly busy on a day-to-day basis tracking any significant incidents of mass violence, extremist propaganda releases that come in. So it is certainly never a dull day. And a couple of years ago, as Dave mentioned, I was fortunate enough to begin pursuing my master's at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at NPS, which is, of course, where I met Dave. And the topic that I'm presenting to you all on today is the role, like I said, of triggering or catalytic events in leading to targeted acts of violence, which is ultimately what I decided to write my thesis on. But I will note that my curiosity, my interest in this topic began well before I ended up writing my thesis on it. So I've been briefing on this topic for a while at the NYPD in various capacities. And with each kind of major crisis or catalyst that happened and that we saw a flurry of extremist propaganda, reactionary violence in response to, that kind of gave me additional data points to focus on with that research. And I would say my work on the counterterrorism workshops that I mentioned, the after action report following the Vegas shooting, sparked my interest in not just preparing for, but also anticipating acts of violence and better understanding their perpetrators, which I think is also a really fascinating area to study. So for my research at NPS, like I said, I chose to focus on just one piece of this puzzle, which is the role of what you'll hear me refer to as catalytic events in pushing an individual to violence. So on the most basic, simple level, I define a catalytic event, like you see there up on the screen, as any external occurrence that plays a significant role in mobilizing a malicious actor to plan or carry out an act of violence. So catalytic events can motivate individuals to plot really complex, involved acts of violence that there was a lot of planning for. It can also spark violence that appears or is just relatively impulsive, also incredibly tactically simple. And I would say the common denominator here and kind of the ultimate litmus test for the cases that I chose to include in my thesis was whether I can make a compelling case that without that catalytic event, that particular act of violence may not have ultimately occurred in the first place. So before I go any further, and this is a slide I often show when I present on this topic, I like to take a step back and just give you an even clearer picture of what I mean by a catalytic event. So this diagram shows some examples of what I call internal versus external catalytic events that can drive a person to violence. So on that left side of the screen, you see what I would call internal catalytic events or internal triggers. So these are direct personal triggers. For example, like you see up there, workplace conflict, failing in school, divorce, eviction, isolation. And of course, I would say 99 times out of 100, humans react to these types of personal stressors and triggering factors in nonviolent ways, but especially when you're dealing with an individual of concern, a crisis like this can play a really significant role in leading to a violent outcome. But I will say, and this is why I like to make a distinction, because internal triggers are personal in nature and they don't have the ability to spark numerous acts of violence beyond that one person affected by that event, they don't have the same sort of broad predictive value for law enforcement as external triggers, which is why in my research, I decided to narrow in on what you see on the right side of the screen, which are external catalytic events. So these are potential catalytic events that a perpetrator may not have a personal connection to, but that can still play a significant role in mobilizing them to violence. So a political development, a controversial court ruling. So I think of, for example, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, police-involved shooting, any police-involved use of force, really, large-scale civil unrest, protests, a global crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing situation with Israel and Hamas, which I'll get into in a bit, or even just another high-profile attack. And I'll say, too, the external trigger could really be one of several notable factors on the road to violence, or it could be the determining factor. It can play a very different role for the perpetrators involved. So as part of my thesis, the thesis that I worked on, I looked at plots and attacks that I assessed to be driven, at least in part, at least in some way, by the three major catalytic events that you see up there on the screen: the COVID-19 pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and the 2020 presidential election. Sorry, that advanced on its own somehow. It's a ghost in here. But I wanted to gain insight into the ways that these catalytic events mobilized individuals to violence. So I established a connection between the cases I included in my research and the catalytic events based on reviewing the perpetrator's own statements. So I don't know why it keeps doing that. But what they posted on social media, the targets they chose, open source reporting on the incidents, court proceedings. So I was seeking really to answer two primary questions. One of those being, what role do catalytic events play in mobilizing individuals to violence? And two, how should law enforcement agencies position themselves to be able to better predict them coming, with the ultimate goal really of developing a framework for law enforcement to better understand and confront it. I think in the counterterrorism space in particular, we tend to focus a lot on extremist ideologies, on belief systems and their role in an individual's path to violence. So whether someone, for example, supports ISIS or Al-Qaeda or a racially, ethnically motivated violent extremist group. But I think for me, more and more, as I've dove into this research, of concern are the individuals that wouldn't have been on our radar either way, that they weren't associated with any particular extremist ideology or a group, and that they're really being driven by particular grievances. So it makes it a lot more difficult for them to be on our radar, and thus for us to see them coming, essentially. So in looking at all the cases I did, I found that there appeared to be three primary ways that catalytic events trigger someone to violence. Firstly, by presenting what they see as an opportunity to maximize violence or capitalize on chaos. For example, one case in particular in my data set really fell in this category. There was a disrupted plot outside of Kansas City where an individual who I believe was already on law enforcement's radar, a racially, ethnically motivated violent extremist, had explored a range of different targets, but then ultimately settled on plotting a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device attack at a hospital at the onset of the pandemic. And the assessment of officials in the aftermath of that, the attack didn't occur, it was disrupted, but that the goal of that individual, or why they chose to target a hospital amid the pandemic, was to exploit public fear at that time. So the catalytic event in this case really narrowed and actually altered, ultimately, his targeting selection. The second way the catalytic events mobilize individuals to violence is by exacerbating grievances and really contributing to their radicalization. So individuals in this category may have no prior links to extremist ideologies. They could be primarily driven by rage following that specific event. And a lot of the examples of the cases that I looked at were some of those lower level Molotov cocktail attacks targeting police following the killing of George Floyd. Cases where a catalytic event really determined a target for the first time. So like I said, individuals who likely would not have been on our radar. And then that final category is where a catalytic event compounds or interacts with personal stressors, leading to this violence that may appear impulsive, may appear random. So one of the cases in my data set of my thesis was an individual who stabbed a couple seemingly at random in Nashville after being denied access to a homeless shelter because of COVID-19 restrictions at the time. He didn't have the proper documentation to show that he had been tested. And ultimately, in talking to officials, he indicated that he had a lot of grievances related to COVID and specifically how it was kind of exacerbating his own situation. The other thing I'll say is among my findings here, aside from kind of codifying this way of conceptualizing things into this typology, is that catalytic events appear to play a really central role in a perpetrator's target selection and also the timing of their attacks. So many of the perpetrators in at least the data set that I looked at mobilized to violence incredibly quickly, sometimes even within days, which I think underscores the importance of focusing on this. So you may be thinking, all right, Kelli, so what? So the next step here, now that we have this categories, it's just a way of thinking about the problem. Now, as law enforcement, what can we actually do about this? So on the right hand of the slide, you see some broad prevention and mitigation measures that I recommended that could correspond to the different ways that catalytic events mobilize individuals to violence. So firstly, being assessing the resonance of a catalytic event with current subjects of concern. So seeing how you have individuals so as a law enforcement agency, subjects that you may be investigating at the time, how is this major catalytic event that just occurred, say, for example, the Israel-Hamas conflict, how could this potentially speed up their desire to ultimately perpetrate an act of violence? Secondly, would be implementing or enhancing protective measures at certain locations or for specific individuals. And the reason why I laid out this typology is because it's different across the different groups. So an opportunistic individual would likely be seeking to target something where there would be a lot of media publicity, a lot of visibility, trying to maximize casualties, where someone in that grievance-based category could be trying to target something more symbolic in nature. It may not be just with the goal of maximizing casualties. So for example, someone really holding grievances in response to a public official implementing certain measures could seek to target that one official, mostly on the basis of those grievances that are driving them to perpetrate that attack.
Kelli,
Yeah.
Kelli, I need to interrupt you because I said I wouldn't interrupt you, but I have to. I'm sorry.
Go for it, Dave.
Terrorism studies has this thing, they talk about perception of relative deprivation by groups generally. Would that fit into your grievance-based and your personal stressors? Is that where that would come in, or does it come in at a different place?
Yeah, I think it's challenging too. And the reason I actually put these on this slide overlapping in a very deliberate way, because there's a lot of crossover between all of these.
Okay.
That's not to say that if someone fell in what I would consider a grievance-based category, that there wasn't an element of personal stressors here too. I purposely in my thesis did not mark each incident in one of these categories because I didn't want to pigeonhole to that. I think there's a lot of crossover. Mostly where the value of this is, I think, is in identifying what mitigation and protective measures are associated with these types. It's essentially a thought exercise.
Thank you. I apologize.
No, you're good. Interrupt me as much as you want. So then thirdly is just enhancing the situational awareness and preparedness of stakeholders who are relevant to that potential catalytic event. So I'll get into this, especially when we get into Israel and Hamas, but in that case, working with individuals in the faith-based religious communities that would be particularly affected. So recognizing, hey, we have this crisis that could catalyze individuals to targeted acts of violence. These are the individuals, these are the stakeholders that not only do we need to make aware of this, but we know are going to be particularly anxious given the incidents we've seen in response. And then finally is just tracking online threats, violent extremist propaganda linked to a catalytic event. So once again, I'm going to get into this even more with Israel and Hamas, but a good marker for something that's likely to be viewed as a catalytic event is when you see a lot of foreign terrorist organizations, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, racially motivated extremist groups, releasing these propaganda documents, encouraging their supporters to get angry, to capitalize on these events, and recommending particular tactical and targeting guidance. So tracking these types of releases also, once again, gives us as law enforcement another avenue to say, hey, these are the locations that we need to be focused on from a protective standpoint. And from tracking online threats also allows us to potentially identify an individual who may not have been on our radar before, but is showing that they are very aggrieved by this particular event. So I wrote my thesis prior to the October 7 attacks and the subsequent ongoing conflict, but like I've alluded to thus far, I think, and at least I hope, that it's pretty clear to see how this fits within the catalytic events framework. So since the onset of the conflict, of course, we've witnessed reactionary civil unrest, in some cases involving protest clashes, whether between protest and counter-protest groups or between protest groups and law enforcement. We've also seen targeted acts of violence, hate crimes, other acts of destruction, intimidation, some perpetrated by known extremists who either saw the situation as an opportunity or radicalized further because of it. Others motivated really by deep-seated rage and grievances linked to that conflict. I'm not going to go individually into all of these incidents on the screen, but you see here some high-profile incidents that have occurred in the U.S. demonstrating how the conflict has reverberated here. So that first incident is, I think, one of the earliest that happened following the onset of the conflict. The really tragic fatal stabbing of that 6-year-old boy by his landlord outside of Chicago, Illinois. And we've seen, too, that incident really referenced in ISIS, Al-Qaeda extremist propaganda, once again, to try to really encourage followers to perpetrate follow-on attacks. So we could utilize the catalytic events framework to systematically walk through how we would approach this conflict as law enforcement. So, for example, what subjects currently on our radar could be galvanized by this conflict? What would be opportunistic targets? So protests are really what come to my mind. A lot of visibility, a lot of publicity, a lot of potential for mass casualties. What would be grievance-based targets? Like I mentioned, perhaps, and we've seen it, houses of worship, other sites associated with the Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, and Muslim communities. Now, I think it's important, as I wrap up this portion, to say I am not claiming to have discovered this wholly new phenomenon, but I do think that there is value in thinking about the threats that we face in a very deliberate and targeted, methodical way. And my hope is, with conducting this research, providing this initial typology of catalytic events, is really to contribute to that effort. This isn't to say that as law enforcement, we don't undertake a lot of these measures already, because we certainly do. This is, I think, just a way for us to say, okay, we've identified a potential catalytic event. What are the steps we're about to take? What are the locations that we need to harden? What are the stakeholders, or who rather are the stakeholders that we need to reach out to? And in speaking, to pivot a little bit before we open it up for the back and forth conversational portion, in speaking with Dave, especially for any students who may be on the call, we felt it would be valuable for me to just offer some kind of general lessons, like I said, some little nuggets that I've learned from my career thus far, acknowledging that I am still very early in my career, and I definitely still have much to learn. But firstly, I would say is identify the opportunities in each new experience. So when I first started out as an analyst, supporting those counterterrorism workshops and exercises that I mentioned, I was simply the one sitting in the very back of these rooms, furiously taking notes that we could use later in our after action reports to try to evaluate any strengths and areas for improvement. And you may not think of being a note taker as a particularly interesting or glamorous gig, and it's not, but I can't even begin to tell you the amount of invaluable tidbits and insights that I picked up just from sitting in those rooms. I learned so much about law enforcement's response to an act of mass violence just from listening, from sitting in on those conversations as an outsider, as a witness to them. And I've since, I would say, tried to really leverage that knowledge to assist me in how I approach my current role. All to say, whether it's a new internship, a new job, and you are the lowest man on the totem pole, I think there's always so much to be gained. And I would just really encourage you to proactively identify any opportunities in whatever new experiences that you may have, because you never know how much it's going to aid you down the road. Secondly, think you're ready to lead, make it known. So I think some people are and there's this natural human tendency to be kind of scared to express that we're ready for a next level of responsibility, or that when we are ready for it, our managers will simply recognize that and bestow it upon us. But there's no set formula for these things. So my really defining experience working on that after action report on the contract side was because I asked my manager if I could do it. I was not the most senior analyst on that team, but I saw an opportunity. I was particularly interested in that project, and I decided to step up. I would say it never hurts just to raise your hand for these opportunities if you feel like you're ready for them. Absolute worst case scenario, they tell you it might not be your time, but I find it really hard to believe that anyone wouldn't be appreciative of you taking that initiative and kind of being willing to take that next step. Third, for the love of God, do not take yourself too seriously. I feel like at literally every stage in your career, there is so much to learn from the perspectives and experience of everyone around you. And Dave can attest to this, in my grad school cohort, I was the youngest person in the room, and I had so much to learn from my other colleagues that were there. So I think it's important to, that's not to say don't be proud of yourself and proud of your accomplishments, but humble yourself as well. Next, I would say figure out what drives you and really lean into that. So in every job, there will be taskings, there will be projects that may not necessarily excite us, and that is okay. That is normal. But if you have the opportunity to really dive into a topic or a project that you are particularly passionate about, I would encourage you to lean into it. You're all in this field, I would presume, because you are, to a degree, like we all are, very mission driven. So I think sometimes it helps to stop and just remind yourself why you do what you do. I have been, like I said, briefing, writing about this topic of catalytic events in some capacity for probably 3 years now. I think everyone in my office is sick of hearing me say it. But I feel very strongly about the research that I've done, contributing even in an incredibly small way to law enforcement prevention and mitigation efforts that could potentially make us even a little bit safer. And I would say it's what gets me personally excited to get out of bed in the morning and come to work. And then finally, also, sorry, I haven't been moving for so long that the lights went off in this room. Let me turn them back on. There we go. Finally, I would say, and I would encourage you to seek out mentors that are invested in your success. I can almost guarantee you that there are so many people out there that really do want to see you shine, want to see you excel, especially in the area we work in. I think sometimes people forget it is to our collective benefit for us all to succeed in this area of public safety. So don't be afraid to ask for advice of your professors, your managers, your mentors, anyone you encounter along the way, random guest speakers that you may come across, like myself. And I'm leaving, and Dave, you're welcome to share this later too. I'm leaving my contact information on the slide because I genuinely want you to reach out to me if you have any thoughts on the presentation later, because I'm continually trying to improve upon this. I'm hopeful that I can implement and action some of this, hopefully at some point. And any advice as well to anything that I could potentially contribute. And on that last part as well, I would say please do, for those of you who have been in the field for a while, please do pay it forward. I know that I have very much appreciated the advice, the input from my mentors along the way. I'm sure you have all also. So I think it's important, and sometimes we forget about just how impactful that could be for someone just starting on in their career. So I've been blabbering on a lot. At this point, I'm going to kick it back over to you, Dave, and
Okay.
we can jump
So,
into the Q&A portion
why
of it.
why don't we do this, and we'll make sure that your email is available to folks. But let's take down your slides, and then there we go.
Yep.
And because I have about 14 dozen questions I want to ask you. And people are already putting their questions in this question and answer deal. Daggone it. But I'm gonna jump ahead here just a second, because I want to say one thing that I think is terribly important to Homeland Security writ large. You were almost beating up your own framework, and you weren't, but you were saying, I'm not claiming this is, nobody's ever thought about these things before, but I would say within Homeland Security, we are desperate for frameworks. People need frameworks to think through wicked problems. I mean, that's what analysis is. That's what, that's what a critical thinker is somebody who can, I call it framed thinking, but who can use a framework to think through something. And I think what you've given here, because I was a cop about 240 years ago, and that's a framework that I could have used. These are the bubbles that I need to know how they overlap and are going to lead to something. That's outstanding. I do want to ask one other thing. So, because with your background, and we have a bunch of emergency manager type folks, and we have terrorism type folks. What about this crossover? Because you've done a little bit, I mean, of both. How do you speak to that, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I will say, so having been involved in a ton of exercises and workshops, one of the main components that we are always testing is that intelligence and information sharing piece. It not only comes up in every single exercise, it's often a really central part of it, and it is an area where there are always gaps. And when I came, I will say too, into my intel analysis role, I found that there was an opportunity for me also to kind of bring over some of that experience. So I've actually, in the course of my time with the police department, I've helped run some exercises here. And I think it's valuable to have the perspective of an intel analyst and someone working in law enforcement as you're building out those exercises. And I'm actually surprised that there's not as much crossover as there is, because in crafting the kind of scenarios and discussion questions that drive exercises, having been very much entrenched in that role, it's super valuable to know where exactly you need to test organizations. So I'm actually surprised, like I said, that there's not more of an overlap there.
Yeah, the expertise is useful in these exercises, I would think. I want to ask, well, I'm going to go to these, and then maybe I'll have time to ask one other hard one here. Bob Leveroni is asking, this gentleman is one of the nation's foremost authorities on handling large crowds that are out of control. So, but he says, does predisposition to violence precede the catalytic event or vice versa?
I would think you would in some way need to be predisposed to being someone capable of perpetrating an act of violence before that catalytic event ultimately occurs. Because I guess think of all, even outside of external catalytic events, going back to internal, we experience internal triggers every single day. And most people, the vast, vast majority of people, do not take that next step to perpetrate violence. So I think you need to be predisposed, which I will also caveat here. I am not a psychologist. I do not have a psychology degree or background. But I would think that, yeah, if you are not an individual predisposed to violence, that catalytic event wouldn't have as much of an effect as it did.
So if you're predisposed to write a letter to the editor, it's going to be, the catalytic event may lead you to do something, but it's not to wipe somebody out. Yeah.
Yep.
I would
Which
agree.
you could be someone who's predisposed to violence, someone with violent tendencies, that never experiences some type of trigger that ultimately leads you in that direction. There's that too, which is why I think catalytic events are so central. And as I said, put people on our radar or lead to people perpetrating violence who might not have otherwise.
And there's going to be different levels, right? I mean, there could be a catalytic event that really makes me angry, and there could be a catalytic event that makes me, that pushes me over the edge beyond what I can emotionally contain.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Angie English asked this. Thanks, Kelli. Incredible research and presentation. From a social psychology and complexity perspective, the term, quote, tipping point is used. And from a terrorist perspective, we use the term radicalization. Is a catalytic event similar? If not, how do we differentiate that? It's a great question.
I think you could think of tipping point and catalytic event as somewhat synonymous. I think tipping point, though, is typically used in the context of something very personal to someone. At least that's where I've seen it used more. But yeah, catalytic event, to be frank with you, was a term that I just latched onto for whatever reason. It's what made sense to me when I started kind of conceptualizing all of this. But obviously, triggering event, catalytic event, tipping point, there's plenty of different terms out there to describe generally the type of phenomenon that I'm talking about.
Right. So I want to ask a little slightly different question. Right after 9/11, NYPD, and it was not real loved. They sent people all over the world and they based them there to create relationships, to get information earlier and upfront. And I have heard from a number of people how that was valuable. Is that something that you're able to use as an intel analyst on a daily basis? And is that sent to you as, like, with the agency, it'd be like reporting a daily report? Oh, so it is. Okay.
Yep. So I will say my team, actually, the Global Risk Intelligence team, is the primary team that is working with our NYPD liaisons. So we have, I believe, 16 of them at this point in the US and abroad as well, not serving as intel officers, but really meant to be a conduit of intel and information sharing between their host agency and then us back in New York. So there's that constant flow of information back and forth. And that really is helpful, especially for understanding. So anytime, like I said, a significant attack, an incident pops up abroad, we're looking to see, does this intersect at all with New York? And if we were to see a similar type of incident or attack occur, how would we respond to it? So we're trying to learn from all of these tactics.
Well, so you game it even if it's not yours.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because we could experience a similar incident here. So we want to be learning not just from incidents that occur in New York, but abroad as well. And I think just having our liaisons all over the place really just quickens that information sharing, just makes it so we get that on a much quicker and more frequent basis. And yeah, from a strategic intel sharing perspective, I think it's just incredibly valuable.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. We have another question here. It says, how difficult is it for an intel analyst to eliminate personal and or institutional bias when doing their job? And, and I want to segue pretty quickly into this Hamas attack as well. And I think this is an interesting place to do it because I have a lot of friends over the last 30 years who are in the terrorism business. And this particular attack has been different, even from 9/11, in trying to deal with the emotionality and the bias. Do you find that? And if you could respond to this question
Yeah.
as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we are not robots. That is for sure. But I think it's just it's not pretending that we don't have these biases. It's making sure we check them at the door. So I think it's constantly checking in with ourselves. And anytime, at least I write something, I'm approaching something, I'm going, okay, am I approaching this from an objective perspective? What kind of personal feelings about this particular topic am I bringing to this situation? So it's maintaining, I think, at all times, just an awareness of the fact that those biases are there and checking them because, like I said, especially with an incident and ongoing conflict as horrific as the one that we're experiencing, you are going to have personal feelings on these matters. That is normal. That is human. That is okay. And I don't think pretending otherwise is even particularly productive. So at times, yeah, it can be difficult. But I think ultimately it's our commitment to making sure that we get the most accurate, objective intelligence out there is really what makes us kind of compartmentalize when we need to.
Right. Yeah. One thing that has been useful to me, and I've worked on I've led two different analytical teams, is having somebody who can tell me, hey, Dave, you're full of it right here. You got to stop.
Yeah.
And having somebody who you have that working relationship with that can call you on getting a little too pushy can be helpful. So
Which we
can
do
we
that. We
switch
do that
over?
with each other too.
Yeah. Yeah.
As
I think
analysts,
you have to have that
we
kind
call
of
each other out all the time. Yep.
yeah, and that's why you find intelligence shops, they're not very hierarchical. They end up being kind of flat because everybody argues all the time.
We do.
Yeah, that's fun. I mean, that's called Thursday. But I do want to switch over here to this attack by Hamas. Because I have some ideas and I want to bounce them off an expert. Um, you know, Israel had gotten to where they mowed the grass, right? There was an acceptable level of violence, and it wasn't that they were okay with Israelis being killed, but people are going to get killed. That's just reality. They would fire a few rockets. They would usually kill about 10 to 1. So if 10 Israelis got killed, it was usually about 100 Palestinians would die. But this one seemed different to everybody. And it seemed different in part because Israel is, the startup nation and they have all this great intel.
Yep.
How come they didn't see it coming? But terrorism studies people know that terrorism is about communication too, right? So, I mean, if you're not communicating your message, so how have you guys dealt with that? I mean, and how does this fit into your research on a triggering event? Because I haven't seen in the last 20 years, this is the triggering event in the terrorism studies community.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I'll say in terms of not seeing something like this coming, I think that's where certain domestic crises can distract from existential external threats. That's just a reality. And that's something that kind of every country contends with when they're in the midst of domestic political turmoil.
So, okay,
Yeah.
hang on a second, because I mean, Netanyahu gets indicted in 2019. That kind of takes your eye off the ball. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it could potentially.
Well, fortunately, we haven't had anything like that here.
No,
oh, wait, maybe
never
we have.
do.
Okay. So
but the other thing back to how it fits in this framework, I'll say too, something that I've been thinking of, and it's not even necessarily within the body of my thesis at this moment, but how does one even systematically identify that something could be a catalytic event? Like, what are the signs that we're seeing, that we're observing, that could signify to us that, hey, we have this potential catalytic event on our hands? And the few major things that I've seen, one being the level of civil unrest following these incidents, that you have this really broad, this really significant public anger playing out on the streets. So that's usually part of it. We saw that following the killing of George Floyd. We saw that with COVID. We saw that amidst the 2020 presidential election. So that was a common denominator across all of those cases. For the Israel-Hamas situation particularly, I think anytime you have kind of a storied, controversial history like there is with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, any sort of event, any sort of crisis that falls within that is going to spark people with holding various beliefs to a level of rage whenever these types of things happen. I'll also say another kind of signpost is the reaction by foreign terrorist organizations, by extremists to these types of incidents. I mentioned that FTOs, ISIS, Al-Qaeda really jumped on this because they saw an opportunity. And we saw that once again, post-COVID, post-Floyd, the amount of propaganda graphics that we're referencing those conflicts, or those crises rather. And the really interesting thing, maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but the interesting thing to me too, in this context, is the exploitation of it by racially, ethnically motivated violent extremists. So by your neo-Nazi extremist type groups who kind of take this, like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of approach, and really using it to incite anti-Semitic violence. So that's something that we've seen a lot as well.
Yeah,
I would say those are the main signposts.
That's really interesting, and I'm concerned going into the 24 presidential election that everybody is going to want to use this as see what happens, and both sides will use that to illustrate their perspective when it doesn't. We know nothing has to illustrate their perspective if it is reframed and then used.
Yeah, no, and the upcoming 2024 presidential election was part of the impetus for me writing this.
Yes.
I think even I have a line in there where, like, there is a sense of urgency as we approach the 2024 presidential election, because this could most certainly, especially given everything that we saw in 2020, become another potential catalytic event, and we would have our head in the sand if we didn't see it coming.
How could it not? How could it not be a catalytic event, given the last 4 years of what we've seen civil unrest on both sides, by the way? How could it not be?
Yeah. No, it's anytime you have, I think, a certain level of polarization, you are always going to have an environment that is really primed for that. And we may kind of be simmering right now, but then once we get towards the election again, I unfortunately can't imagine it going any other way than being somewhat of a catalytic event.
Right. So you did mention Takfiri Salafi jihadists being revved up by this event, and everybody wants to be the Palestinian patron. Not that many people want to actually take some action on their part. And certainly Hamas killed off Al-Qaeda's people in 2009 when they tried to start a mosque there in Gaza. But what are you seeing from that? And is it from any group in particular, or is it from an affiliate group that has been more motivated because of this?
I think the Al-Qaeda affiliates have been particularly vocal, especially in pushing out tactical guidance or even just instructions in general. So here are the things that you can do to support your brothers in Gaza. So, and those range from boycotting Israeli companies to perpetrating attacks against any Israeli or Jewish target in the West as
Right.
well. Also targeting U.S. military interests, since they see the U.S. as really being complicit in all of this. So we've seen a lot of that, in particular from Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. ISIS is interesting. That is particularly exploitative, given that ISIS is very not compatible with Hamas.
Right.
I think they are too nationalist focused. So it's interesting. Sometimes I think there's a lack of nuance when you talk about the different reactions of these groups. And while ISIS may be seeking to capitalize on this, they are not pro Hamas.
No, absolutely. But it does go to show you, what was it? Rahm Emanuel says, never let a good catastrophe go to waste. Yeah. And so ISIS just following that. Let me hang on. We got another one here. If given a confluence of catalytic events, 2024 election, Israel, Hamas, etc., do you handle them separately or as one? Yeah, that's a great question, because like your Venn diagrams, they all overlap. It's not.
I think you're dealing with them concurrently, frankly. If we are still in the midst of the Israel-Hamas conflict amid the 2024 presidential election, you are tracking that and identifying potential targets associated with either potential catalytic event. And it just means that we need to be that much more on the ball, because you now have multiple crises that you're concerned could mobilize even very different groups of individuals to violence. So we don't have the luxury of just focusing on one crisis at one time, unfortunately. And we saw that too, I would say, with the killing of Floyd and COVID. There was a lot of overlap there. Right. Even Floyd, COVID, and the 2020 presidential election, there was a lot of overlap there. So it is tracking all of these threats, all of this extremist propaganda, all of these threats all at once.
But operationally, you handle them all separately. That's just reality. But strategically, I'm not convinced we have a plan to deal with it strategically as a unified event. Maybe it's way above my pay grade, so maybe it's all going to be just fine, but
it's above mine as well. So
there you go. I have one other question, because we're just about out of time. And it has to do with Henry Kissinger died the other day. And I've got this LinkedIn account, which anyway, half the people, they were excited about it. The other half was reading Rolling Stone and wanted him, he was a war criminal. And I have seen both sides of that, but global order does seem to be changing. And I have argued that after the fall of the Soviet Union, we kind of ran around like a golden retriever in the front room, knocking stuff off the couch and the table with our tails. People are not listening to us in the same way. And these catalytic events, we are not able to say, this country, you don't do this. Yeah. This country, you don't do that, because they don't care anymore. Yeah. How do you take that into your analysis now when you bring this forward to operationalize strategically? I mean, that's a true geopolitical situation that I'm not convinced we have the answer to.
Yeah, and I'll say too, like, we on my team take all of these geopolitical events into account. We are not just focusing on terrorist attacks. Because like I said, all of these crises, whether they're terrorism related or not, have the potential to dip into our realm.
Right, yeah.
That is always the case. We can't ignore these major crises or these major geopolitical crises that are happening. So I don't have a good answer for you, but we are
I don't either,
we are
but
we are in dire times.
hey, we're right at the top of the hour, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming and doing this. And I know it's late where you are. I am going to share your information because I suspect
Yeah,
people would like to follow up with you. Let me just say this on behalf of the Idaho State University and the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Program. I want to say thank you to everybody who came, and a special thank you to you, Kelli.
Thanks so much.
For more information on our program, please visit the website at www.isu.edu/ESD for Emergency Services Department, and we will help you out. And thank you very much. And folks, I hope you have a great evening.
Yes,
Be
thank
well
you,
now.
everyone.